OSA. He will be presenting his book, A World Trading System for the 21st Century, talking about adapting the WTO to the changed economic environment. So after the session, the books will be available for sales here at a preferential price or at the bookshop at the back of the room. And we'll be happy also to welcome you at our next session during the agriculture week in November for further books at the WTO library. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks, Bob, for coming. I'm extremely excited to host this book launch. So you've already heard some of the, Bob was already introduced, with his titles and what universities he's at and has been at. But let me add to this, because there's a very simple way of summing it up. I think Bob is quite simply the most important economist working on WTO issues of our time. I would really say it like that. So I think it's really important. I'm very glad that he's here and that he's sharing his ideas with you. So of course you don't have to necessarily agree with all of his ideas just because he's such an important economist, but I do think he really, these ideas deserve your careful attention and careful consideration, and that's what we are here to do. So Bob, I don't know, maybe you want to just start, give a quick overview of your main findings, and then we just take it from there.
All right, thanks, Ralph. With an introduction like that, it's going to be hard not to disappoint, but I'm really happy to be here and tell you about the book that I published last end of December. And a little bit about myself, as Ralph and Olivier said, I'm an economics professor at Dartmouth, but I spent much of my career at the University of Wisconsin and Stanford before that. And I teach international trade, but most of my work has been on trade agreements. So this is what I'm most interested in and what I do. And the book is actually in the Olin Lecture Series, which is a series that is published by MIT Press. And I was very happy to have this book published in that series. So the book is coming out at a time when globalization is really at a crossroads, and the multilateral trading system was created in the middle of the 20th century and now governed by the WTO is in trouble. And the system's facing a growing list of 21st century challenges that raise questions about the legitimacy of the WTO as the arbiter of global trade rules. And the questions that I ask in the book are things like, is the WTO capable of meeting these challenges, or do we need a new global trade order for the 21st century? And I argue in the book that the basic architecture of the WTO is in fact well suited to guide the design of a world trading system that can address the 21st century challenges. And therefore, if I had to summarize in a bumper sticker what the book's message is, it would be that the guidance for the design of the world trading system of the 21st century is probably less close to Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg's famous motto, move fast and break things, and closer to the British, now again ubiquitous wartime slogan from World War II, keep calm and carry on. And by that conclusion, I'm not indicating that all is fine at the WTO or that it's perfect and doesn't need to adjust to new circumstances. But what I am going to try to argue, and do argue in the book, is that the foundation of the WTO principles and the GATT before it is a strong foundation that can work to handle many of the challenges that we face in this new century. So there are basically five, I would call them insights from the book that I want to try to emphasize today and talk through with you and with Ralph. And I'll just list them here, and then we can get through as many as we can. First, you don't have to be a free trader to support the WTO. Second, the WTO's shallow integration approach is a strength, not a weakness. Third, China's economy is compatible with WTO commitments. Fourth, climate goals are compatible with WTO commitments. And fifth, the WTO may need a hegemon in order to survive. So those are the 5 points that I'm hoping to get, and I'm happy to elaborate on each one.
Well, thanks, Bob. Lots of interesting questions and even more interesting statements. I'm really happy that I only have to ask the question today and not provide the answer. And it's maybe also good that not so many people are listening to our conversation. So let's maybe start with the first one. You don't have to be a free trader to support the WTO. I should have used that line, in handling some of the questions when we launched the World Trade Report, or even just now, in the session, where we do get a lot of questions, or get some questions that are kind of based on that kind of thinking, that the WTO is all about free trade and Washington consensus. So maybe tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, so thanks. I think that's a really important starting point. And it's important for really understanding the design of the GATT rules, I think. To start, I'm an economist, Ralph is an economist, but we all know as economists that the case for free trade depends on specialists that may not always hold in the real world. And in particular, when a country removes an import tariff, there will typically be winners, who would be the consumers of those now cheaper imports, but also often losers, who are the workers who must compete with those increased imports. But economists typically argue that under certain assumptions, the aggregate gains from elimination of the tariffs are big enough that the winners could compensate the losers, and in principle at least, everyone in the country could gain. And that, along with absence of other market failures, is in essence the economist's case for free trade. Well, when stated very clearly in that way, it's pretty clear that there are many reasons why the assumptions needed for that are not going to hold for many countries. And in particular, the compensation of the winners to the losers, that at least in principle is possible, according to economists, often doesn't get paid in the real world. And as a result, tariff cuts have important distributional consequences that each nation has to grapple with. And understandably, countries are going to feel differently about those distributional consequences and the trade-offs inherent in them, depending on their circumstances, the level of their development, the amount of other policy interventions that they have, et cetera. And for this reason, most economists don't view the case for free trade as a one-size-fits-all policy prescription that applies to all countries at all times. So if the rules of the WTO were actually built on the case for free trade, then I would agree that the legitimacy of the WTO is in real question as the constitution of the world trading system. And by legitimacy, what do I mean? I mean, is this an institution that can serve as a constitution that even if you as a country don't agree with every decision that is made in the WTO, maybe in the legal finding against you, you still can have respect for the institution as an institution that is designed to solve a problem that we can all agree ought to be solved. And if the WTO were built on the case for free trade, I think many countries would question that legitimacy, because the case for free trade might well not apply to them, and they might legitimately view an institution that was seeking that as the goal not to be in their interest. But the WTO rules reflect a logic for each country that, in the jargon of economists, can be summarized as internalize the international externalities of your tariff choices. And that is a logic for good policy choices that's distinct from the case for free trade, and that applies far more generally to the world. And according to this logic, all countries can better achieve their goals, whatever those goals might be, if each country takes into account, that is, internalizes, the cost that it imposes on other countries, that is, the externality, when it chooses to protect its country from imports. And WTO rules essentially create an environment where countries are induced to do just that. In this environment, countries are encouraged, through voluntary WTO-sponsored negotiations, and there have been 8 GATT multilateral negotiations up to the creation of the WTO in 1995, encouraged to lower their tariffs in proportion to the cost that those tariffs are imposing on their trading partners. And when each country has done that, each has internalized the international externalities associated with its tariff choices, and all countries can gain. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get to free trade for any country, or certainly not all countries. And in fact, for all countries to gain from this, we have to have the pie get bigger, so to speak, so that every country can have a bigger piece of the pie. And in evaluating this gain and this pie, it's important to recall that the GATT-WTO bills itself as a member-driven organization. And I think it really is. And to continue with the pie analogy, every WTO member comes to the bargaining table with ingredients for that pie. And these ingredients all get thrown into one big pot. And then the Director General and her staff has a big wooden spoon, and she stirs this pot and adjusts the heat according to agreed upon rules, and works for something good to come out that everyone will be happy with. And getting rid of the international cost-shifting motive will lead to lower tariffs, and it will ensure that the pie is getting bigger and that everyone can gain. But how much the tariffs will actually be liberalized from country to country in that agreement in order to maximize the size of the pie depends entirely on the preferences and the circumstances of individual members. So the point that I started with relies on that basic observation.
That's really, really interesting. So you're saying that, you know, what we do here fundamentally is to internalize trade policy externalities, as you were saying it, or, you know, put more plainly, prevent countries from gaining at the expense of other countries. You talked about the wooden spoon that the Director General has. I haven't seen it yet. She must be hiding it somewhere. But maybe tell us a little bit about how we do it. So do we have So when you say the WTO is fundamentally about you know, preventing countries in engaging in these beggar than neighbor policies, then what is it in our rules that makes this work?
Yeah, so that's a really important question as well. And there's actually, I think, a surprising answer to it for the case of the WTO. And the answer can help illustrate just how different the international externality problem is for the WTO and trade agreements in general than it would be for international externality problems that other international agreements or international cooperation attempt to handle. So take climate agreements, climate change, for example. It's clear that the design of a climate agreement could not by itself impact the nature of the carbon externality that the agreement is attempting to address, because that externality travels through the Earth's atmosphere, through the atmospheric chemistry, and it's what economists call non-pecuniary. It's a non-pecuniary externality in the sense that it doesn't travel through markets, it travels through the atmosphere. But in the case of a trade agreement, the externality is pecuniary. It's traveling through trade and through prices. When another country raises their tariff, the way it affects me is my exporters don't get to export as much into their market and may have to lower their price in order to actually sell into that market. That's an external effect on another country, but it's not traveling through the atmosphere, through chemistry. It's traveling through markets. And because it's traveling through markets, there are opportunities to design the policy environment in a trade agreement, which is what the WTO does, in a way that can actually impact the shape of that externality. So what I'm about to describe to you in terms of how I think the structure of the WTO rules can really impact the externality and be logically designed relative to this externality is quite specific to the trade externality, and you wouldn't be able to do this in a climate agreement. So when tariffs are constrained to the non-discrimination principle of the GATT and the WTO, the most favored nation principle, the impacts of the tariff on trade volumes and prices are going to be different. In fact, they're going to be simpler than when tariffs are discriminatory. So one of the rules that is the DG spoon, is MFN, is non-discrimination. And when two countries reciprocally change their tariffs, or when a single country changes its tariffs along with its labor standards or climate standards in a particular way, the trade externality can be mitigated or even eliminated. So that's a second part of the spoon, is reciprocity. MFN and reciprocity, two of the pillars of the GATT architecture. Well, this is why the choices made in the design of a trade agreement can be so important to the agreement's success, and why the GATT-WTO choices of an architecture built on MFN and reciprocity, also with a focus on shallow integration that we can talk about a bit later, has a logic that can support the WTO's claim to legitimacy as the constitution of the world trading system. And that's a main theme in the book, and that's what I want to elaborate briefly on right now. So let me be more specific about MFN and reciprocity. Let's consider the externality that arises from an increase in the tariff of some country when the tariff is restricted to be MFN. Well, then all exporters abroad of that product are going to lose, because all of them are going to face this higher tariff into the country. That's a negative externality that we could try to internalize. But what if countries increase their tariffs instead in a discriminatory way? So I increase my tariff on you, but I don't increase it on your competing exporting countries that are also exporting into my market. Well, I would still be imposing a negative externality on you, but I would actually imposing a positive externality on all of the other countries who didn't have to face that tariff, because you're cut out of their competition and they get to sell into my market. So right there, MFN versus discriminatory tariffs changes the nature of the externality problem that has to be solved. And that is crucial for the success of the WTO. Is a trade agreement or international institution that relies on MFN as a core rule, simplifies the externality problem. Everybody, aside from my country, feels the same about my tariff. They all don't like it. Whereas in a discriminatory world, there are some countries who love my tariff if they're against other countries, and other countries who hate my tariff if they're against them. And it makes getting rid of externalities much more complicated. Well, that's MFN, and of course, this sort of thing, climate agreement, we can't think of, or I can't think of, a rule that you can impose in the policy space that you could say, let's just simplify the carbon externality with this particular rule that we adopt. So that's why the design of these rules in trade agreements, I think, is extremely important if the trade agreement is trying to get at the externality. Well, a similar thing can be said for reciprocity. So reciprocity is the norm in the GATT and the WTO by which tariff changes are expected to lead to equal increase in the volume of my exports and my imports. So if I'm going to lower a tariff in a negotiation, I am hoping that the increase in my imports volumes is going to be matched by somebody out there lowering a tariff that is going to allow my exports to increase by the same volume. And that kind of balancing, reciprocity, also has an impact on the externality and ends up potentially neutralizing the externality of tariff changes. So the combination of reciprocity and MFN, and we can get into this a bit more if the details are interesting to people, shapes the externality, simplifies it, and potentially neutralizes it in a way that facilitates negotiation to eliminate that externality and get to the biggest pie that we can get, given the differences and preferences of all governments. And so I think there's really something timeless about the way the GATT-WTO is designed, because it is designed well to address this particular problem that many economic analyses have pointed to as the problem for a trade agreement to solve. And that's why I think the WTO actually did work well, and the GATT before it in the 20th century. And the key question for us in the 21st century is, have the problems changed? If the nature of the problem is the same, then we should be relying on this same institution to deal with these new variants of the problem. If the nature of the problem has changed, then yes, we need a fundamental difference. And that's kind of an upshot of it.
Thanks, Bob. That's really interesting, really insightful that we begin to understand the spoon that we are using here to make things work. let's maybe come to the second point, also in the interest of time. And you've kind of given the transition already, talking about some of the new challenges that are coming up. But just to set this up a little bit, you say the second, or not the second challenge, the second insight that your book delivers, you say, is that the WTO's shallow integration approach is a strength and not a weakness. So maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so especially in today's world, where much of the activity in trade negotiations seems to be focused on deep integration and regional agreements that are going much more after regulatory harmonization and behind the border measures. The stance that the WTO's more shallow integration approach is a strength is definitely something that needs to be defended, and I think economists.
Maybe you can even explain briefly what you mean by shallow integration.
Right. So what shallow integration, what I mean by that is the traditional GATT approach of focusing on border measures, tariffs and quotas, and liberalizing those without focusing on what countries are doing behind the border in their labor standards, in their building codes, in their health and safety standards, in their climate standards. And in the way GATT was designed, the focus of negotiations was on increasing market access. That is, increasing the access of foreign exporters into my market. And the way that was done was focusing on tariffs as the tool that restricts market access and negotiating those down. And then there were some rules put in place because it was understood, of course, that there are many policies that could be used to restrict market access, not just tariffs, not just import quotas, but also labor standards, building codes, what have you. And so there were natural rules put in place in the GATT, non-discrimination, national treatment, rules of this nature. And in the WTO, those have been elaborated in the TPT agreement and the SPS agreement that were essentially to handle the whatever market access implications there might be from a country's choice of behind the border measures. But what is not true in the GATT and also in the WTO, with some exceptions, growing exceptions that we can talk about, is direct negotiations over standards. And that's what I mean by deep integration, direct negotiations over the harmonization of standards across countries. And those are much less common in the WTO, much less of a focus. And why might this be a strength for the WTO? Well, I believe it's a strength because ultimately, if you see the problem that the GATT and the WTO is trying to solve, as internalizing these externalities of trade policy choices, well, in a world in which those tariffs and border measures are unconstrained, those tariffs are the best way to do beggar thy neighbor policies on other countries. And by beggar thy neighbor, I mean the negative externalities that other countries are suffering, that a country would use if it were not a GATT member or a WTO member. And why would it do that? Well, it's the ability to shift costs onto other countries of my policies. So when I raise my tariff, if I'm a big enough market that exporters actually care about it, those exporters are going to tend to lower their prices into my market in order to preserve market share. And that means I'm going to get cheaper imports from them, even if the price in my own market is higher because of the tariff. And whatever policy I was achieving from that tariff, some of the costs are going to be shifted onto foreigners. And so I'm getting the benefits, well, however I view the benefits of the higher prices in my market, but I'm not paying all the costs. Some of those costs are being borne by foreigners. Well, that's the beggar thy neighbor aspect of the international externality, which is a cost-shifting component. And if there were no limits on tariffs, I would use tariffs as the first best policy to do that. And I wouldn't be distorting my labor standards, my building codes, my environmental codes. So in 1947, when the GATT was created, that was basically the way the world was. There was very little cooperation in tariffs. Countries could do whatever they wanted autonomously in their tariffs. And the focus of the GATT negotiators was not on building codes. It was not on health standards. It was on tariffs because according to their perception and according to the logic of economics, that's exactly where the problem was. Trade volumes were too low, but they were too low because tariffs were too high, not because labor standards were too low or because building codes were not strict enough or because we were discriminating against foreign products with our labor standards. We already had a way to discriminate against foreign products with our tariffs. Well, if that's the case, if that's where we start, then the focus of the GATT, which is a shallow integration focus on the policies that are the problem, create greater market access by getting countries to negotiate those lower tariffs, and then just have a minimal set of rules which make sure the countries, once their tariffs are lowered, don't through the back door start lowering their labor standards or discriminating with their building codes in a way to backdoor protect their importers. That's a good way to organize. And that's how GATT was for the entire history of GATT, and essentially how the WTO is some exceptions. And there certainly have been elaborations on the basic rules that apply to domestic policies, like the TBT agreement and the SPS agreement. There's been the SCM agreement, which is an agreement on subsidies, which we can talk about. But the bottom line is shallow integration, from an economics perspective, has a perfectly legitimate role to play. And one could make the argument that you can achieve all you want in a negotiation with shallow integration rather than negotiating directly over your labor standards and your building codes and your environmental standards with every country. You can achieve the same thing with the shallow integration approach and allow countries to preserve their sovereignty over those domestic policies, because they can make their choices of these normally domestic policies subject to much more benign rules of non-discrimination rather than having them in Geneva with other countries and negotiating our building codes, et cetera. So that's why I would argue that the WTO shallow integration approach is actually a strength, not a weakness.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. That's really interesting, and again, I think helps us understand why the GATT WTO architecture has worked so well for so many years. But then, when I think about what's going on today, so I mean, I haven't been here for that long, and maybe there's a working group on building code that I don't know. But there are basically all the efforts that I can think of at the moment don't fall into this box of shallow integration plainly defined. So on the multilateral level, we have the trade facilitation agreement. We had the fisheries subsidies agreement just at MC12. And then if you think about the ongoing plurilateral initiatives, we have services, domestic regulation, investment facilitation for development, discussions on e-commerce. So there's a lot ongoing that's not either about tariffs directly or indirectly about market access, but seems more, let's put it very broadly, let's maybe not talk about, we can maybe postpone the subsidies question to later if we have time, but it's more about trade facilitation, more broadly. So how do you think about trade facilitation in that context?
Yeah, very interesting point. And I would definitely say that to some degree, the WTO has moved away to at least a little bit from the GATT principles. But a number of the things that you might think of as moving away, I think of more of it as elaboration on shallow integration. So as I mentioned, TBT and SPS, so all the negotiations that go on there, I think can be viewed on the initial national treatment clause of the GATT, and so I would classify that as strengthening these relatively benign non-discrimination rules on domestic policies that keep countries from using their domestic policies as a disguised protection. and that's very much in line with shallow integration to make it work. Trade facilitation, I think, is actually shallow integration in the sense that it was very much focused on customs and things at the port, and not focused on building codes domestically or labor standards. And so I view the trade facilitation as right in line with this view that this is very much a completely consistent with the GATT WTO shallow integration approach. There definitely are moves away from shallow integration. The TRIPS agreement is a very very clear one that TRIPS as trade experts certainly know, is not a market access agreement. It's a private property rights agreement. And so it is really different than basically the rest of the WTO, and certainly what GATT was about. GATT was always about market access, not about private property rights. And economists actually find TRIPS somewhat controversial in terms of whether it should be in the WTO, whether it fits with the rest of the WTO mandate. But I agree that it has moved away from the original GATT. The fishery subsidy agreement is a really fascinating case and a great one to bring up, because on the one hand, it's an elaboration on the SCM agreement, basically saying we're going to carve out these particular subsidies on fisheries that conform to specificity according to the SCM definition, and we're going to make illegal ones that are offered to certain kinds of illegal fisheries or underreported fisheries, and that is a very interesting case that brings up the SCM agreement itself. And there again, with economists, the SCM agreement is sort of controversial in the WTO because in the original GATT, there was no SCM agreement. There was the way that countries dealt with subsidies was through a non-violation claim. Originally in GATT, there was no violation if you introduced a new subsidy. That you introduced after you had agreed to a tariff cut that was offering market access, if that undercut the value of that market, and therefore eroded the reciprocity that the other country expected from a negotiation, that country could bring a non-violation claim. And those claims were brought early in the GATT years, and the view was, yes, a new unexpected subsidy to producers of an import competing good would really undercut the value of what we expect a tariff cut to do. And so while we won't say that this country who's introduced the new subsidy is in violation of anything, because there were no rules in the GATT that said you can't subsidize, it was a so-called non-violation claim saying either you can do something to bring back the market access in this product that you implied by your tariff cut, or the other country can reciprocate and withdraw and rebalance to get reciprocity. And so the fishery subsidy is an example of that, where now with the SCM, the view is that there should be more codified rules to handle subsidies. And these rules are a little bit, not a little bit, I would say quite controversial among economists, and I think also across countries, as we're seeing today, in terms of whether they were the right rules for the WTO to generate. And one of the differences between the WTO rules on SCM versus the GATT original rules on subsidies is that the subsidy prohibitions and even actions, if they're not prohibited, no longer have anything to do with whether they undercut a market access claim. So there are subsidies that are prohibited, there are subsidies that are actionable on a product. Even if I was a country that never granted a tariff cut to anybody on this product, in the old GATT days, I could do any subsidy I wanted because I hadn't made any market access commitment on that product. But under the SCM, another country could challenge me if that subsidy is specific and if it's having trade effects. So it's not completely clear in my mind and in many economists' mind, and I think also in many countries, whether the SCM agreement was actually designed correctly or not. And I think that's one of the areas where there could be rethinking of the SCM agreement, maybe to move it back toward these principles that I'm focusing on of GATT, and it would move back a little bit to shallow integration. But in terms of the fisheries, there's a really important extra thing, and that is there's another externality going on in fisheries. What I've been talking about are pecuniary externalities, ones that travel through markets. My argument is that the GATT and the WTO is very well designed as an institution to handle these externalities. That is it should be its mandate and the thing that it never strays from. There's another externality in the fisheries, which is the common resource, right? There's a lack of property rights in fisheries. So there is an externality there that is non-pecuniary, and it might well make sense for either the WTO or some international agreement that cooperated with the WTO to have a subsidies fishing agreement which internalize that non-pecuniary externality. And I think that's one way to think about this. The fisheries agreement is like a carve out of the SCM to a particular subsidy problem that relates to a non-pecuniary common pool resource that, yes, economists would say, yes, that's another problem that should be handled. But notice it's not the classic trade problem of, say, weak environmental standards, where we would say, if a country lowers its environmental standards in order to be able to compete with other countries that have lower environmental standards for their own reasons, that's what we would call a race to the bottom. And that is something that the WTO should prevent, because that's about market access. That's a pecuniary externality. Other countries have low environmental standards. Maybe this country feels that in order to compete, it has to lower its, and that's the externality that actually should be handled within the WTO. So that's a long-winded way of saying the fishery subsidy is really interesting. I think there's definitely a carve-out for thinking about it as legitimate, but it also strays a little bit from these principles.
Thanks, Bob. Now it's getting really interesting, touching on issues that we deal with here every day. We're almost, we're not quite running out of time, but time is advancing. So let me move to the next insight that you formulate in your book, which is a really interesting one. So you say China's economy is compatible with WTO. If I read it correctly, China's economy is compatible with WTO commitments. Is that how you say it? So maybe you can explain what you mean.
Right. So of course we know that China has been one of the entry of China into the WTO in 2001 has proven to be one of the major challenges that the WTO now faces in the 21st century. And the question is, how do we handle that, and what should be done about it? Is the WTO equipped to do it? And the issue is essentially the non-market features of China, and along with non-discrimination, or MFN, one of the principles that I mentioned, another core principle that I mentioned is reciprocity. And so when countries join the WTO, when they're negotiating tariffs, the expectation is that they're going to maintain a balance known as reciprocity in their negotiations that ensures that the tariff cuts and the liberalization that I'm doing as a result of the negotiation, that's allowing in a volume of imports into my country, an increase in the volume of imports, is matched by liberalization that you're giving me that is going to allow my exports to approximately match the volume. And when China joined the WTO, like any other country, the expectation is that it was going to get permanent MFN treatment by all of the existing WTO members, and it had to give up tariff cuts that would reciprocate that. Didn't matter whether it was a market economy or non-market economy. It was supposed to reciprocate and give market access increases in its markets that were approximately reciprocal to those that it was gaining when it joined the WTO. Well, at the time, in 2001, the view of China was it was, of course, a non-market economy at the time, but it was quickly going to evolve to a market economy. And because of that, when countries negotiated their protocol of accession with China, they focused on tariff cuts, and they focused primarily on getting China to cut its tariffs on various products. And there were some special things, like some agreements about its export restrictions, which was unusual for countries joining the WTO. But for the most part, China was asked to cut its tariffs in a way that was thought at the time to deliver reciprocity to the member countries. And what was thought was, well, tariffs are, when you cut your tariffs, there are things that happen in your domestic market to your consumers and your producers, and those things create more imports, more import demand, and that is exactly what you're agreeing to do when you cut your tariffs. So the view was, well, that's what China's going to do. It's going to be a market economy. It will behave approximately like a market economy in a few years, and these tariff cuts will deliver reciprocity. Well, it turns out that didn't really happen, probably for a number of reasons, but perhaps mainly because China ended up not evolving toward a market economy in any way, in anywhere near or to the level that many economies, including the US at the time, expected would happen. And so China is now in the position where it is a member of the WTO, but other WTO members, the US is particularly vocal, but other countries too, including the EU, are feeling that China has not reciprocated. It has not done what a normal WTO member would do when it joins the WTO, and that is give up reciprocal market access commitments of its own. And that's because the tariff cuts that it did, according to the US argument, and I think plausibly, those tariff cuts didn't have the impact on the Chinese economy that it would have had if China were a market economy. So the question is, what's to be done? And one view is the WTO membership needs to decouple from China, because if China is not going to be a market economy, the rules of the WTO don't work. Remember, I said there were two sets of rules. One is you cut your tariffs when you negotiate, and that gives my exporters more access to your market. And we've just talked through why that doesn't seem to work in China, because if they're not responding to price signals, consumers and producers of market price signals, then there's no guarantee that a cut in Chinese tariffs are going to lead to more imports. And then secondly, the other set of rules in the GATT and the WTO are these rules that govern the domestic policy choices. The TBT, SPS, the non-discrimination. But if you're a non-market economy, again, those are not going to constrain the Chinese government from doing all sorts of things in a more command economy way that could thwart the market access that other countries thought they were going to get. So there's one argument out there is that if China is not willing to move to a market economy, then it should not be part of the WTO, because the WTO is a rules-based system that is built on dealing with market economies. So that is a possibility, but I would say that should really be a last resort, and that there are really compelling reasons not to do that. And the first compelling reason is China is not the first non-market economy to join the World Trading System. There were a number of non-market economies who joined the GATT, and a good example is Poland, who joined the GATT in 1967 and was not expected to become a market economy at the time. So this was a case where a medium-sized non-market economy, not as big as China obviously, but not tiny, was negotiating with GATT members. And the GATT's membership, of course, understood exactly that the rules that applied to other GATT members, tariff cuts, non-discrimination, they were not going to work for getting reciprocity out of Poland. So what the Article of Protocol of Accession for Poland, which is essentially 2 paragraphs, said is that Poland will agree to grow its import volumes multilaterally by a certain percentage each year. And that percentage was reflective of how much its exports were expected to grow in volume as a new member of the GATT because of the low tariffs that it was going to get. So reciprocity was achieved between Poland and the other GATT members through a totally different way of achieving reciprocity, and an end around the non-market aspects, and simply a quantitative agreement. So I'm not advocating necessarily that China should be asked to do that, but what I am saying is there is no reason to think that China can't be a good a member in good standing of the WTO simply because it's a non-market economy. If it finds ways to reciprocate the way Poland did in 1967, just as legitimate a member of the WTO as any other. So the real problem is finding these ways for China to reciprocate. And I think if China, if the issue were put to China in that way, rather than saying you need to change your economic system, there might be more progress in actually getting to a solution.
Thanks, Bob. We are running out of time, and I realized I do actually have a meeting at 1:30. So if I can ask, one more question, and then maybe, we'll open it to the floor, and you can also discuss afterwards a little bit, I'm sure. But I do want to hear if you can summarize in like 3 minutes, 4 minutes, your fourth point that I find really relevant also to what's going on here. Climate goals are compatible with WTO commitments, you say. Can you maybe summarize in 4 minutes, 5 minutes, what the key message is there?
Yeah, so that's like a small topic, easy to summarize in 4 minutes, but I will try. And if I run over, you can duck out, and
okay.
I'll keep talking. So yes, climate goals are compatible with the WTO commitments, and the way I think of it is it's all about the market access focus of the GATT and what should be the market access focus, and I think generally is, of the WTO. And that is when a country agrees to lower a tariff in a WTO market access negotiation. Okay, the last major one was the Uruguay round in 1995 when many countries were negotiating their tariff cuts and market access agreements. It's agreeing to improve conditions of competition to foreign exporters in its market. And rather than the tariff cut per se, it's the commitment to conditions of competition that is legally protected. So that's really important because what happens then if I cut my tariff, say as the EU did, and agreed to further tariff cuts in 1995 in the Uruguay round, and then decides that climate, carbon is a real problem, and we got to have a emissions trading system. We got to have a carbon tax. And we're going to put this on after we've already negotiated these tariff commitments in the Uruguay round. Now we're going to put these carbon taxes on. And if we were not allowed to change our tariffs, these carbon taxes are going to disadvantage many of our producers relative to foreign exporters who don't have these carbon taxes. And so if the EU were actually held to its Uruguay round tariffs without any further adjustments, it would actually, in imposing these carbon taxes, it would be granting more market access unilaterally to other countries because it's raising the cost of its own competitors and worsening their conditions competition relative to foreigners. So that would be a bad thing for two reasons. First of all, it would make it very difficult politically for the EU to actually put on a carbon tax because its producers would be saying you're killing us on the world trade front. And secondly, it would probably cause carbon leakage, meaning the producers in the EU of these carbon-intensive goods would be put out of business, and producers in other countries, including China and India, would be able to produce these goods at potentially much more carbon-intensive techniques. And in the end, the world could actually have higher carbon because of the EU carbon taxes than not. So that's the idea of a carbon border adjustment. Which allows the EU to essentially acknowledge that when it negotiated its tariffs in the Uruguay round, it negotiated to a level of market access, and now that it is introducing taxes that are disadvantaging its producers. In order to maintain that level of market access, it needs to be allowed to raise its tariffs just enough to offset the adverse market access of the carbon taxes that it's putting on. From the point of view of outsiders, it should be neutral. The conditions of competition with its domestic producers are unchanged because they have higher production taxes, but they're also protected by a higher tariff. And if that tariff is set just right, market access is unchanged, and that's the logic of the GATT. Those should be stable property rights over market access. And so there's an argument for why a carbon border adjustment should be absolutely GATT and WTO appropriate. But what I've just described has a very big difference between what the CBAM, the European Union Carbon Border Adjustment, is doing and what I think would be absolutely non-controversial from the point of view of the WTO. And that is what I described is an MFN, non-discriminatory rise in EU tariffs on goods who are going to be produced where the producers are now subject to this carbon tax. Those tariffs should be increased on an MFN basis to keep the volume of imports coming into the EU just the same as it would have been, but they should not be put on the basis of the carbon content of the foreign producers. That's, in this view, that's a discriminatory tariff, and that is far more controversial within the WTO. The EU, of course, argues that it's not discrimination, it's WTO consistent, and as a WTO supporter, I laud the EU for actually trying to be WTO consistent, as opposed to, I think the US doesn't even care to some degree. But I would argue that there are really two things that the EU is trying to do in their CBAM that could be separated usefully. The first thing is they're trying to stop carbon leakage and trying to stop the political cost of the carbon tax, and that could be done with an MFN increase in their border tariff. The second thing is they're trying to incentivize China and India to actually clean up their act, and that's where putting the carbon tax on the basis of the exporter's carbon content, that's what that's doing. And we can argue whether that's a laudable goal. Maybe it is, but it is a goal that goes beyond the WTO traditional mandate of market access, secure market access property rights. So in the book, and I've described further, I would argue that there's a very useful separation of these two issues. And border adjustments that are MFN, that just maintain market access, should be completely non-controversial in the WTO. Whereas border adjustments that actually try to incentivize foreign countries to clean up their carbon, those maybe, that would be the object of litigation I would expect in the WTO, and could be, different, I think reasonable people could argue about whether that should happen. But if one were to separate that, and on the basis of the logic of these issues, that separation is very clean, I think countries could go much faster and further without worry of WTO litigation in carbon taxes and carbon border adjustments by using the first kind of carbon border adjustment. Okay.
Thank you, Bob. These are very important issues, and as you point out, also very controversial issues. So I'm glad I only have to ask the questions and not comment on any of this. So I have to leave in a few minutes, but I would like to give people the opportunity to ask some questions. And we can also, of course, stay a little bit longer and then talk with Bob. I don't think you have anything right afterwards, right? So I'm sure you'd be happy to answer some questions. Maybe I can just pass the microphone to someone. How about, you have one. Oh, fantastic.
Well, thank you very much. That was an absolutely superb talk. Thank you so much. Henry Lovett, University of Glasgow. You mentioned in your opening remarks.
Sorry, maybe closer?
You mentioned in your opening remarks this idea that a hegemon may be necessary for the institution. I'd love to hear a bit more about that, if you can expand. And also query, in a linked point from your last comment, what are the implications of your thinking for institutional reform, particularly dispute settlements? And that's picking up in your litigation reference.
Okay, yeah, really interesting questions. On the first, so the first question was the fifth point that I had mentioned was we may need a hegemon in order to support the WTO, and could I elaborate on that? And I will. And the second question was what are the implications for reform of the dispute settlement procedures? Both really important questions. So I'll just comment briefly on each of them. The hegemon point kind of follows in an interesting way because when we step back and we think, we're talking here about a rules-based institution. We read that all the time. The WTO is a rules-based institution. Well, what do we really mean by that? Well, what I'm trying to articulate is we do mean something, and we mean that it is based on the rules of MFN and reciprocity and shallow integration. That's kind of the architecture. And if you think about what those rules do, suppose I'm a really big, powerful country, you might ask the question, why would I abide by a rules-based institution? Like if I'm big and powerful, I don't need rules to protect me. Why don't I go and negotiate in a power-based way, use my power to negotiate with each country, and not abide by the rules? And ironically, of course, the U.S. was one of the co-creators of the GATT, of this institutional setting that we have in 1947, and it was the dominant economy at the time, along with the U.K. And so the question is, what did the U.S. see in this? And so the first thing is to realize that if the U.S. was really saying we're going to which the U.S. did until late 80s when it started doing many more free trade agreements, but it was very much MFN up until then. How does that affect the ability of the U.S. to exert its power? Well, if the U.S. has to lower its tariff on an MFN basis, and if other countries have to lower their tariff on an MFN basis, then if the U.S. had a lot of bargaining power, other countries are going to enjoy whatever bargaining power the U.S. has when the U.S. pushes this small country to lower its tariffs, because all the other countries are going to get that low tariff too. And so MFN right there is going to dilute the U.S. ability to exert its bargaining power. It's going to kind of tie its hands. And then reciprocity, even more so, because reciprocity is saying the U.S. is not going to be able to push a country to do really big tariff cuts, and the U.S. is only going to do really little ones, because that would violate reciprocity. And the U.S. was saying, no, our norm is going to be reciprocity. Every country can expect that in MFN. So what that says then is, in 1947, the U.S., the most powerful country in the world economically, was tying its hands and giving up the ability to go after countries one by one and punish them and get nice. And so the question is, why would it ever do that? And an answer is, it was so powerful that in order to actually induce countries to come in and participate in the world trading system, it had to tie its hands. It's a bit like the bully on the playground who, if there's no rules, the bully will show up every morning, but no one else will show up because they know they're going to get beaten up. But if the principal can come out and say, there are new rules, the bully actually might like that too, because now at least there's playmates out there, and I'm better off playing by rules than playing by myself. And in some sense, the participation effect of committing to rules is an argument that says, yes, a hegemon like the US in the early 1950s was needed in order to create a rules-based system and support it, because it was so powerful that without the rules-based system, no one would liberalize and join in this world trading system. So now we get to today, and that's where the relevance of the growing emerging markets and developing world comes in, and the U.S.
Bob, before you get in today, I have to run. So let me thank you. I think we can go on for another like 5 minutes or so, but don't go on for so long. And then, I mean, you can go on talking amongst each other for as long as you want. But I have to excuse myself. So thanks so much.
Thanks for your time.
For coming.
Thank you, Ralph.
And I will see you later.
Okay, thank you. So to make a long story short, now that the hegemon has declined, the U.S. position is much less major. It's possible that when there's lots of countries, so there's no big bully anymore who really needs the rules, now there's a bunch of tough people, and they may all say, you know what, it's better to not have the rules because I'm still bigger than most of them. They're not going to show up, and I'm going to do better by bargaining without the rules. And in some ways, one could argue that President Trump's approach was exactly that. His approach to China and to Europe was essentially out of the rules-based system and kind of perhaps consistent with this declining hegemon approach. So the sad point is these rules have a lot of very nice features. They protect smaller countries from what otherwise might happen to them with a power-based system of negotiation, but they may be at a point where they could be eroding just because the landscape has changed, and we may have to wait to a dawn of multilateralization again until a new hegemon arises, which of course could be China, could be India, could be the US again, could be EU, depending. Okay, and then very quickly, the other question is a great question about the dispute settlement procedures. Really fascinating, and I think there is in the GATT days. The dispute settlement procedure was much less strong, and the WTO ushered in the new dispute settlement procedures. And one of the main, ironically maybe, since the U.S. was pushing for the dispute settlement procedure in the WTO, but one of the main sticking points now is the U.S. view that the appellate body has overreached. And the way I think of the legal issue, which I think is definitely a challenge to the WTO, obviously, because right now we have no appellate body operative, but I don't see it as an existential challenge to the basics of the WTO and the GATT before it, because the GATT existed without appellate body, so it could exist, the WTO could exist again without an appellate body in principle. But the way I see the view is the appellate body essentially began thinking that the contract that the WTO members negotiated in the Uruguay round was somewhat incomplete. It had some vague language, and that part of the role of the appellate body was to interpret that vague language, and that became somewhat precedent-setting. And what the U.S. sees is that's creating law, and the U.S. said, we never wanted the WTO appellate body to ever create law. It should, as it says in the agreement, it should neither add to or diminish obligations of any country, and we feel that that's what's happening. That's a really fascinating legal issue, whether it is happening or not, whether you think actually it should be happening, because given that it's a complete contract, maybe you want sort of common law to complete the contract, as the appellate body might. Or maybe you take the view that the whole reason that the WTO agreement was vague was that there were some things that countries couldn't agree on, and they agreed to be vague so that they could each go home and say what they meant. And so these are great issues that have to be resolved. But in some ways, I've heard some legal scholars suggest that one potential resolution is to make the appellate body more like this U.S. Supreme Court, in that it does not have to make a decision on anything that comes to it. It decides, cases are brought to it, and it can decide, is this legal issue ready and ripe for us to make a call, or are we not ready? And that could be kind of a middle ground where the appellate body can say, no, this is too ambiguous and novel, we're not even going to touch it. Whereas for some things, maybe the WTO membership is ready for the appellate body to clarify. So these are issues that are ongoing. One way or another, we've got to get a resolution to how things work. It's very important. But I actually personally think that it will get resolved, and I'm hopeful that the basic principles of the GATT-WTO are going to survive this.
Yes, if I may. Thanks for this fantastic presentation. Now, on subsidies, many people in the context of climate change, they say we need to look at the subsidies agreement and let's make a distinction between good subsidies and bad subsidies. And let's say that subsidies that are good for sustainable development, subsidies that serve a climate change objective, let's make them non-actionable. Now, how do you look at that from this perspective of deep versus shallow integration? Do you think that distinguishing between good and bad domestic subsidies, let's leave export subsidies aside, but distinguishing between good and bad domestic subsidies, is that consistent with shallow integration, or is that something else?
Right, yeah, really important question. And I guess in the SCM agreement, Article 8 of the agreement originally had certain kinds of subsidies that were non-actionable, and that was a temporary thing, and if no one disagreed, it would expire, and it did expire. So that exception to regional development subsidies and things like that ended up expiring. So I've seen legal scholars suggesting to essentially use Article 8 to bring back some non-actionable subsidies on issues that the membership could all agree these are important, maybe climate, maybe regional development, et cetera. And personally, I think that that could well make sense. And I might even go a little further and say I think it's an interesting question as to why why the WTO decided in the SCM agreement that the best way to deal with subsidies was to try to write language that governed them in a blanket way rather than take the approach to subsidies that they took to tariffs. So tariffs were never blanket regulated, other than that they have to be MFN. You could have any tariff you want. And then the view was tariffs would be negotiated down because countries would reciprocally agree, I'll cut my tariff in this sector if you'll cut yours in that, and we'll reciprocally both benefit, and that's how we got tariffs down. One could imagine that there could be an engine like that for subsidies. Maybe not the only engine, but one could imagine a much more permissive SCM that allowed lots of subsidies that were non-actionable, maybe climate, maybe other things, but then also set up a negotiation and a framework in which countries could exchange commitments on subsidies. So if your subsidy is hurting me and to chips is hurting you, we might agree to both reciprocally reduce our subsidies just the way we would a tariff, and that kind of a commitment could be much easier to administer because just like a tariff binding is relatively easy to administer and litigate, those kind of commitments on subsidies could be potentially easy and put less burden on the words of the specific broad definition of a subsidy, whether it's specific, and trying to regulate subsidies at a broad level across the whole landscape. So short answer, I guess, is I think the Article 8 carve out, I think, is an interesting thing, and it's possible that one might even want to go a little further and try some new ways. And what that would do, of course, it would let the members themselves say what are good and bad subsidies. I wouldn't be saying this subsidy is good or bad that you have on aircraft. I'm just saying it's hurting my aircraft producers, and I value if you would cut it. And if my subsidy on chips is, then you would value my cutting my chip subsidy. And we're not going to be moralistic about whether that's good or bad. It's just this is straight up market access negotiation, and let's just harness that to reduce the harmful subsidy effects that countries are imposing.
We have another question.
Is there time? Okay. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed your presentation and papers you've written over the years. So, as you know, Nuno Limão and some others suggest that like the chief value that trade agreements like the WTO provide comes from certainty, predictability, and market access. Can you hear me?
Yeah, a little bit. Maybe closer to the mic.
Oh, sorry. Sounded like it was squeaking. And so do you see any tension between this certainty-focused view and the reciprocity-focused view you're expressing, where, like, I can see a scenario where regular non-violation complaints and Article 28, tariff-free negotiations would go against certainty, but might be good for maintaining reciprocity and internalizing externalities. Thanks.
Yeah, really interesting question. So about uncertainty, and let me answer it in a kind of a broad way, and that is, I think one potential benefit of the way that the GATT and the WTO are designed is the flexibility that they provide for countries to rethink their commitments. And that flexibility, one way to think about maybe the world we're in now is, at least for industrialized countries, and there's an important carve out for developing countries, but for industrialized countries, much of the liberalization that they wanted to do in market access has been achieved over 60 years. And now it's more a question of kind of maintaining the level of market access in a way that keeps them on what economists would call the efficiency frontier. So it keeps things about right. And when we have various shocks to the world, that might mean raising up my tariffs rather than lowering them further. And the big lowering is pretty much maybe done for industrialized countries, but we might be lowering some, in services, et cetera, but then we might be raising some when we need to do other things. And so the flexibility provided by Article 28 of the renegotiation provisions for the tariffs, and also Article 19, et cetera, can actually be a big plus to allow countries to be able to have this flexibility to rethink. And that's a flexibility that is not there in so, Brexit is a great example. It's not like the UK and the EU could renegotiate things in a very kind of fluid and simple and continuous way. The UK was either in or out, and there was very tortured negotiations, as we all know, to finally figure out the terms on which the UK could leave. Well, for market access commitments in the GATT and the WTO, it's much more fluid. If I need to back off, maybe because my steel producers are being decimated at home and I need to raise some tariffs, I can do that in a fairly simple and fluid way. So that's a good thing if you want flexibility. But now to your point about uncertainty, it's not a good thing if what you're really trying to do is tie the hands of governments not to back off on their commitments. And there is another view of what trade agreements the role they might serve, and that that role is that trade agreements might, for the member countries, serve as devices to tie their hands and commit them to low tariffs when they couldn't otherwise stand up to their constituents and the lobbying. And if that's the view you take, then the flexibilities in the GATT WTO are going to be bad, because just when I want to stand up to a lobby, they're going to say, you can't stand up to me because it's easy for you to raise a tariff under Article 28 and do it for me because I'm hurting, or Article 19. Whereas if the government in question doesn't really need an external agreement like the WTO to tie its hands, it has a constitution, it has strong domestic institutions, then it would presumably like that flexibility to do what it wants. So those two things, which side you come down on that issue depends very much on whether you think governments are using the WTO to tie their hands against their constituents, or rather to internalize international externalities. And it's the former the latter that I have focused on, but there is a very interesting alternative view that would push the latter. And I personally, in the book, I talk a little bit about that, and I think the evidence suggests that the WTO seems to be designed to deal with international externalities rather than tying the hands of countries to free trade. But it's an alternative view that's also an interesting one.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe we can take another question if necessary. Okay. Very good. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for all coming.
Just for the tip, you might buy the book, but we will also publish the event on the WTO library website if you want to review it. Thank you very much.